Hello, my Belfast 1000 Nation. How is everyone doing today? Hopefully everyone's having a great day. If not, hopefully it's getting better from here. Alright. Normally I don't post videos other than Mondays and Fridays, but we just got done with the 2020 Mrballen Scare-thon, and he's got 6 videos up for Halloween for this year. It's not part of a Scare-thon or anything, but I wanted to go ahead and jump into it because Halloween is almost upon us, and that and I really like. Alright, so we're going to start this one off with Mrballen's The Most Terrifying Family You've Never Heard Of, Mature Audiences Only. So, kids, get the hell out the room. Parents, go ahead, turn them lights down low, put on something comfy, cuddle up with someone special, and let's get spooky.
Today's story is about a lesser well-known cult and their heinous ritual that they admitted to performing. This episode is extremely graphic and very upsetting, so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and steal the glass plate inside of their microwave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In the early 1950s, Harold Alexander, who was a young stonemason living in Hamburg, Germany, came in contact with an old man named George Reel. George was the leader of a small religious group called the Lorber Society. This group, which never had a large membership at any point in their short history, was rooted in the Christian faith, but their views were far more extreme than the average Christian congregation. For example, many Christians believe in the concept of self-denial, which in layman's terms means to deny oneself some personal human pleasures, like certain sexual practices or the overindulgence of food or drinking, and all of this is done to gain favor with God. But George and the other members of the Lorber Society took this concept of self-denial to...
You want to go ahead and say it? God must hate me. I'll overindulge in all of that. The drinking, the food, and the... Yep. Just saying. Just saying.
The extreme. They practiced it so aggressively and so literally that nobody in the society could really have a life of their own. All they could do to adhere to their society's very strict rules was to worship God 24/7. In addition to their very severe lifestyles, members of the Lorber Society also believed that anybody outside of their small society was basically evil. So Harold meets George. It's unclear exactly how he meets George, but he does, and immediately Harold is blown away by George. He thinks he's totally incredible, he's so charismatic, and apparently George felt equally highly about Harold. And so right away they have this friendship, they strike up, and Harold and his wife Drogma, they end up joining the Lorber Society, and they completely give themselves over to this very intense lifestyle, and they listen to everything George tells them to do. And then very quickly after Harold and his wife had joined this society, their leader, George, became very ill. ill, and it became clear he was going to die soon. When George was on his deathbed, Harold went to visit him, and after speaking with him privately in this room, Harold emerges and he tells his wife that George has told him that he is going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society once George passes away. And so his wife accepts this, as does the rest of the society members. And then after George actually does die, everyone in the society just turns towards Harold and begins listening to him and following him. It's worth noting that we don't know for sure if George really did tell Harold that he was going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society, or if Harold just made that up because he knew George was going to die soon and he could kind of get away with stealing that title. Over the next few years that Harold was in charge of the Lorber Society, he began introducing a new concept to the members. He would continuously tell them that they needed to be ready for when the next prophet of God returned to the earth. Harold told his members that when this happened, one, Harold would know immediately, and he would tell them.
Oh, yeah.
And two, whatever this prophet wanted, no matter how confusing or crazy or terrible, they had to do it without question because this was God's will. In 1953, so roughly a year or two after Harold has taken over the Lorber Society, he and his wife, Drogma, have their second child. It's their first boy, and they name him Frank. And as soon as this child is born, Harold looks at him and determines that this boy, his son, is the prophet they have all been waiting for. And so he tells his wife and he tells the members of the Lorber Society that his son, Frank, is the prophet of God, and everyone across the board completely accepts it. As the prophet, Frank, grew up, he was shamelessly worshipped and waited on 24/7 by the members of the Lorber Society and his own family. And so naturally, this had a profound impact on the way Frank thought and how he behaved. By the time Frank was at the age of grade school children, he fully believed that he was the prophet of God, and he began using that authority to kind of boss his family around more than he really needed to, especially his three sisters and his mother. But no one ever intervened because, again, this is the prophet of God, and he can do whatever he wants.
Wow.
When Frank turned 16, he started thinking about girls and sex, but he was conflicted because he had been taught everybody outside of this society he was a part of were evil. And so he didn't want to pollute himself by having sex with these evil women. And so he went to his father and told him that he wants to start having sex with his mother and his sisters in order to stay pure. And his father, Harold, not only embraced the idea, he encouraged it. And in fact, he would often join in with his son during the sexual intercourse.
I'll muster up. Oh. Oh my God. Okay, so let's see. This is Drogma the mother, Sabine the sister, 15, Marina sister, 18, and Petra sister, 15. It's behind me, see? Petra sister, 15. I don't. There's. Why would. Huh? I get he's the prophet, but. Couldn't he have. Done his due with like the other people that's in this cult? Or why did it have to be mother and sisters? Because I get the premise that people outside the cult are evil. Gotta stay pure. But the people in the cult are supposed to be pure too, right? So why does it have to be mommy, sister? Mommy, sisters, sisters. Why? Why did the dad join in? That's fucked.
As for the four Alexander women, they completely accepted their new roles as sexual objects because they believed by doing whatever Frank the prophet wanted, they were serving God. Eventually, one of the sisters began talking to some of her very few friends at school about how she was kind of jealous of her other sisters for all the attention they were getting from Frank. And so the friends kind of picked up on this strange relationship between the siblings, and before long, rumors had started about there being some incestuous relations inside of this family, and those rumors eventually made their way to the parents of students, and then from the parents, that made its way to the police, and before long, Harold had discovered that the Hamburg police were about to launch an investigation into his family. And at the same time, Harold also discovered that members of the Lorber Society, they had heard about these incest rumors as well, and they had their own suspicions already, and they were not on board with incest. And so they were very clearly starting to distance themselves from Harold and his family. And so it was pretty clear to Harold that the writing was on the wall. He and his family were no longer welcome in Hamburg. And so he goes to the Lorber Society and kind of retires and says, I'm leaving. You need to find yourself a new leader of this society. And then he and his family completely broke ties with the Lorber Society. They left Hamburg and fled south to Santa Cruz, which is a city on the Canary Islands in Spain. And so they settle into this little apartment inside of this busy city. And very quickly, they fell back into their old routines of constantly worshiping Frank, the prophet of God, despite the fact that they were no longer affiliated with the Lorber Society. And so their actions were now being driven by their own personal belief system. 10 months later, on December 22nd, 1970, a wealthy doctor named Walter Trankler was at his villa, which was located not far from where the Alexanders lived, when he heard a knock at his front door. When he opened the front door, he saw there were these two men who he didn't recognize, who were covered head to toe in what looked like mud. And at first, he was totally taken aback by their appearance and almost wanted to just shut the door. But in order to be polite, he kept the door slightly open and said, hey, how can I help you guys? And the two men would introduce themselves as Harold and Frank Alexander, and they were there to speak with one of their family members, Sabine. Sabine was one of Frank's two younger sisters, and she worked for the doctor as a housemaid. And so the doctor, he didn't know any of Sabine's family members, so he just kind of took their request at face value and said, hold on, let me go get her. So he leaves the front door, he goes into the kitchen, and he finds Sabine, this 15-year-old girl, and he tells her that your father and your brother are waiting for you outside. They want to talk to you. And so Sabine, without saying a word, puts her knife and the food down. She walks out of the kitchen with the doctor, and as they're walking towards the front door, the doctor stops about 10 or 15 feet away from the front door to kind of allow Sabine to walk up and have a semi-private conversation with her relatives, although they're still inside of his house, so he didn't want to go too far. And so the doctor is standing maybe 15 feet away, wondering if he should just turn around or maybe just go into the other room to let them speak, when he overhears the father, Harold, say something truly horrific to his daughter. It was so shocking that the doctor stopped what he was doing, turned, and looked directly at Sabine to see how she was going to react to what she just heard. But to the doctor's absolute shock, Sabine didn't break down and start crying or start screaming out in pain or anguish. Instead, she reached out and grabbed her father's muddy hand and pressed it to her cheek and said, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." And then the two embraced. The doctor stood there totally shocked, staring at these people, wondering what the heck they're doing. Why are they here? What are they talking about? Is this really happening? And then he just kind of blurts out, "Hey, I'll be right back. Stay right there." And then the doctor turned around and darted out of the front hall into another room where he barricaded himself inside, and then he called the police. When the police showed up just a few minutes later, they rolled into the front lot, and they saw Harold, Frank, and Sabine were still just casually standing in the front doorway of the doctor's villa, seemingly not really trying to go anywhere or do anything. And so the police get out of their car, they walk up to the trio, and they say, "What's going on? What are you doing here?" And Harold, very calmly and casually, tells one of the officers the same horrible thing that the doctor overheard him saying to Sabine. Except this time, Harold specified to the officers where this horrible thing took place. He said it happened inside of their...
I'm getting nervous. Like, okay.
The police were shocked at Harold's candidness and the fact that his two kids were standing right next to him and they're hearing what their father is saying.
What is it?
saying they too are just totally detached and very calm, as if nothing their father is saying is having any effect on them. It's just totally business as usual. And so the police asked Harold to repeat the story a few times to make sure they were hearing him correctly, and then they just arrested Harold and his two kids. After the three Alexanders were brought to the police station, three other police officers were sent over to the Alexanders' apartment in Santa Cruz to see if what Harold had said was actually true. And when these officers opened the front door to that apartment, they immediately could tell it was all true. The following is the story of what happened inside of that apartment based on the testimony given by Frank and Harold. On December 21st, 1970, so that's one day before Frank and Harold arrived on the doorstep of the doctor's villa, the father and son were home in their apartment with the mother, Dragma, as well as two of the three sisters. It was 18-year-old Marina and 15-year-old Petra. The other sister, Sabine, she was over at the doctor's villa. She was staying with him for a couple of days while she worked there. At some point that afternoon, Dragma and Harold left the living room and went into one of the bedrooms to lie down and take a nap. And after they lie down, Frank, for some reason, gets up from the living room and walks into the bedroom and sits down on the edge of the bed and just stares down at his mother. And when his mother rolls over and looks up at her son, Frank would later tell police that the look she gave him was suggestive, and it was offensive to Frank, and he believed she was not permitted to look at him that way. And so in this moment that she's looking at him, he said he instinctively knew that the killing hour was upon them. The killing hour was not a Lorber Society concept. It was something that Frank and most likely Harold had come up with, and the rest of the family, the mother and the three sisters, had totally accepted. According to Frank and Harold, women were impure, and the only way to purify them, i.e. send them to heaven and not hell, was to murder them. And so it was just fundamentally understood in the Alexander household that at some point, Frank was going to declare that the killing hour was upon them. And when that happened, all the women in the household were told to stop what they were doing and wait for Frank to sacrifice them. Meaning, wait for Frank to ritualistically kill them. So after Frank has seen this offensive look on his mother's face, he now feels like the killing hour is upon them, and so he literally announces it to his mother and to his father, who's right next to her, and then Frank grabs a nearby wooden coat hanger and strikes his mother on the top of her head. Now, his mother, she's heard that the killing hour is upon them, and he's starting to beat her. And so what does she do? She follows the rules. She flips herself over onto her stomach, puts her hands down by her side, and lays flat and still so Frank can more easily kill her. And so Frank begins wailing on the back of his mother's head with this wooden coat hanger, while his father, Harold, excitedly leaps out of the bed, doesn't try to stop what's going on. He runs into the living room, and he begins very enthusiastically playing the organ. An organ is like a piano that's played a lot of times inside of Christian church.
It's not funny. It's not. Just, it was so exciting. He had to go play it, did he? Oh my God. Oh no. But I mean, wouldn't she technically be excused from that, seeing that she was the vessel for the prophet? La-di-da. This is one the family. Bruh.
And so with all this commotion going on in the house, the other two sisters that were there, Marina and Petra, they come out of their bedrooms into the living room. They see their father playing the organ, and they look into the bedroom where they hear all this noise, and it's Frank murdering their mother. And they're looking at this happening. They're not doing anything. They're just staring at it. And then their father says to them, The killing hour is upon us. You need to get ready. And so the girls, when they hear this, they know the rules. And so they stop watching this attack and they make their way over to the center of the living room and they sit down cross-legged and they begin to patiently wait their turn. After a while, Frank stopped beating his mother, who was now unconscious or perhaps even dead, and he walked out of the bedroom into the living room where he saw his father on the organ and he saw his two sisters sitting on the ground. And so without any hesitation, he walks over to Marina, the older one, the 18-year-old, and he begins hitting her on the top of the head until she slouches over onto the ground motionless. And then he turns to the younger one, Petra, the 15-year-old, and he does the same thing to her until she's laying on the ground motionless. After this, Frank stands up and he leaves the living room and goes into the kitchen where he retrieves a small knife, pruning shears, and a hammer. At this point, it's likely that one or two of the Alexander women were still alive. And so Frank, he comes back into the living room with these tools in hand, and with the organs blaring in the background, he begins to systematically hack off the breasts and genitals of his two sisters and his mother. And apparently this was a very slow and physically difficult task. And so he and his father Harold began switching off. One person would be on the organs while the other was mutilating, and they would switch back and forth until all of the offending parts on these three women had been removed and nailed to the wall. The last mutilation this father and son committed was to cut the heart out of the mother, Dragma, and they wrapped it up in a cord and then nailed this cord to the wall as well. Then, with the three Alexander women either dead or close to death, the father and son began running around the apartment, yelling and singing and rejoicing. They were extremely proud of what they had just done. Later that night, they left the apartment and slept in another property that they owned, and then the following day, December 22nd, they went to the doctor's villa to tell Sabine the good news. And so they knock on the door, the doctor answers, he goes back and gets Sabine. Sabine walks up, and Harold, her father, says to her, "Sabine, we wanted to tell you right away that Frank and I have just finished killing your mother and your sisters." To which Sabine walks up to him, takes her father's hand, presses it to her cheek, and says, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." This, of course, is what the doctor saw and overheard that was so horrible and prompted him to call the police. It was also the moment when he realized that was not mud all over these two men. That was their family members' blood. Psychiatrists would ultimately determine that Frank and Harold were not mentally fit to stand trial, and so they were both committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. Both men never showed any remorse or regret about what they had done. In fact, they continued to justify their actions by saying, because of them, these three women got to go to heaven. As for the one surviving daughter, Sabine, she pleaded with authorities to let her go live with her brother and her father in this asylum, but they rejected this request and sent her to live in a convent, which is a building that nuns live in, and no one really knows what happened to her after that. Shockingly, in 1990, so roughly 20 years after Frank and Harold were put into this asylum, they managed to escape, and they were never caught. To this day, their whereabouts remain unknown. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please...
What? Crazy 1 and Crazy 2 are just running and rampant in wherever. What? Okay, I knock no one for their religious beliefs. No one. Everyone believes in something. I don't care. That's fucked. And last crazy is like, oh, let me go live with them. So because one messed up, they all had to die. Why didn't the other sister have to die too? Is it because she just wasn't there? There's... Oh my God. And they escaped. So you just got two psychopaths running around having babies and then killing them because whatever. Ooh, boy. All right. Yeah. We're moving on. Yeah. Hey, this abandoned mine footage is very creepy.
Today, I'm going to share the story behind one of the creepiest videos on the internet.
I know we're moving on. Just one more quick. It was a routine that the boy would, mommy, sister, right? Maybe that's what she thought he wanted, was a little. She's like, come and get it.
But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's house, and as soon as the like button sits down to watch their favorite TV show, start violently vacuuming right in front of the TV. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In the summer of 2013, a middle-aged man named Frank pulled into a tiny town in Nevada called Kingston. Kingston, which is home to less than 100 people year-round, is so small and desolate and cut off from the rest of the state and really the rest of the country that they don't even have stoplights. It's basically just a collection of a handful of buildings like a laundromat and a saloon that are surrounded on one side by this huge mountain range and on the other just open desert. At the time, there were really only 2 reasons you would find yourself in Kingston, Nevada. One, if you lived there or were visiting someone that lived there. Or 2, if you were going to visit the abandoned mines up in the mountain that are right near Kingston. Frank was in Kingston for the latter. For the last 5 years, Frank had been traveling all over Nevada and California and just the West Coast in general, exploring abandoned mines. And he would film himself while he was in there, and then when he got back to his house, he would upload the footage to his YouTube channel. When he arrived in Kingston, Frank had already uploaded 302 videos to his channel. But despite the very high number of videos on his channel was still very, very small, and it wasn't growing really at all. So for him to be dedicating that much time and energy into making these videos indicated that he wasn't really doing it for YouTube fame. He was doing it because he had a passion for exploring these mines, and he wanted to share it with the few people that subscribed to his channel. And when you look through the first...
That's the key right there. I'm a small channel. I'm a very, very small channel. Like, I do well to break out the triple digits. But I love doing this, so... Guess everyone's got their hobbies, huh?
First 302 videos on his channel, that passion of his really comes through. He always knows the history of the mine he's about to go into, and when he goes inside, if he finds machinery or pieces of equipment that have been left behind, he immediately knows what they are, and he speaks about them with relative sophistication. He has this lingo that sounds like he understands mines on a really granular level. So when Frank arrived in Kingston in 2013, as far as we know, the only reason he was there was just to do what he always did, which is go explore a couple of cool mines, film it, and then put it on his channel. Except this time, Frank's adventure into these mines right outside of Kingston would be cut short by something he just could not explain. However, he captured it on film, and it's terrifying. The 2 mines that Frank was intending to visit were the Victorine mine and the Horton mine. The Horton mine was constructed first in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and when they built it, they expected it to be a gold mine, but there was no gold inside. So they constructed another mine about 900 feet above where the entrance to the Horton mine was. They built this other mine, and inside of that mine, there was gold. This second mine they built was called the Victorine mine. When they built the Victorine mine, they bored this massive hole right outside the entrance to the Victorine mine that went straight down 900 feet directly into the mountain, and this big hole they drilled went right into the Horton mine. This was on purpose. They were basically building the equivalent of a laundry chute, except instead of tossing laundry down it, they would toss the ore they drilled from inside the Victorine mine. They would drop it down the chute. It would fall 900 feet all the way to the Horton mine, and that would save them from needing to carry all of this ore all the way down the mountain. Basically, it was a shortcut for the ore. And in the Horton mine, they built this huge conveyor belt system so that anything that came off of the chute would land at the beginning of this conveyor belt. It would get brought all the way outside of the mine where workers could process it and bring it to town. Finally, in 1989, the Victorine mine ran out of gold, so they permanently shut down that mine as well as the Horton mine. These two mines were located about 4 miles to the west of Kingston's town center. And so when Frank pulled into town, he moved to the western side of town and then found the access road that would bring him out to these mines. And so he just drove on this road that basically shot straight towards this huge mountain range. And after traveling about 4 miles, he reached this very sharp right turn that basically went straight up a mountain. And at this point, there's no more pavement on the road. It's a very narrow trail. It's hard to see. And so Frank would have parked his car, grabbed his camera and his equipment, and begun walking up this mountain. After quite a while, Frank would have passed a couple of run-down old cabins that were kind of overgrown. These cabins were used when these mines were in operation. They helped service the workers while they were out there, but since the mines were abandoned, so too were the cabins. And so when Frank got to these cabins, that would have meant he was very close to the entrance to both of these mines. Frank first went to the Victorine mine, which would have been very easy to spot because right outside of its small entrance was this huge piece of what looked like scaffolding, and that was actually the opening to this huge chute that shot down 900 feet to the Horton mine below. So Frank goes to the Victorine mine and he has a look around, but either Frank didn't film his time inside of the Victorine mine or he just didn't upload it because there's no video of him actually going into the Victorine mine. His camera is turned on this particular day when he's left the Victorine mine and he's walked all the way down to the entrance of the Horton mine. And so we see this video. It opens up with the camera pointing at the entrance to the Horton mine. And the entrance to the Horton mine is very bizarre looking. The entrance, which is 20 feet tall, has all these long strips of metal plating that have been kind of anchored up all around.
We all see it. It looks like a butthole. Don't judge me. It does.
Around the entrance to prevent the entrance from caving in on itself. But despite whatever functional value these copper plates might have had, the aesthetic result is very creepy and makes you not want to go in the entrance. Also, because this mine had been shut down, there's a big gate right in front of this already very foreboding entrance that warns people to not go inside. But Frank seems totally unaffected by this and just strolls right up to the entrance of Horton Mine, and he kind of talks about its history, and then he calmly steps over this warning gate telling people to stay back, and he begins walking into this mine. Right away, Frank notices there's quite a bit of water on the ground, and that's cause for concern.
Okay, we can go in here and just take a quick look. I don't think I'm going to explore this particular mine. There's a little bit too much water in here, and I know this mine is really old, but I just don't think it's wise to go in here when there's water. Try to avoid this if I can.
Frank's not concerned that there is water. It's that the water might be stagnant water. In these abandoned mines, there can be poisonous gases that accumulate, and when there is stagnant water, those gases get absorbed into the stagnant water. And so if Frank were to step into one of those puddles of water, he would release those gases from the water, the so-called bad air, and that can actually be deadly. But as Frank is standing there wondering if he should proceed, he looks down off to the left side, right inside the entranceway, and he notices there's some footprints. So somebody must have come in here recently, and so Frank decides, you know what, I'll go a little bit further in. I'll just be really careful of the water. Frank makes it about 10 feet inside of the entranceway when he lifts his camera up and he looks straight down into the mine, and you get your first look at really what the inside of this mine looks like. And right away, you notice there's this yellow kind of collapsed looking tubing that's hanging down from the ceiling, and that's the old air filtration system. And then when Frank moves maybe another 5 or 10 feet farther into the mine, you see in addition to this air filtration system, there's also all these metal chains that are just kind of dangling from the ceiling, and they're all over the place. And both the tubing and the chains seem to extend all the way into the tunnel out of view. Those chains were previously used to hold up the conveyor belt that stretched the entire distance of this mine, which is 600 feet long. They held that conveyor.
We're all learning something today. Thank you, Mr. Ball.
Belt up, which carried all of the ore from the chute out of the mine. Even though Frank has seen similar setups in other mines he's been into, he would say on camera that there's just something really off about this mine, that it was really sketching him out, and he wasn't really sure if he should keep going.
Yeah, this looks pretty sketchy. I'll go a few feet further in and check it out, but I think I'm going to pass on this one.
He would later reflect on that feeling he had inside of the mine, and he would say, it felt like there was somebody else in that mine watching him. It was just very, very uncomfortable. And so as Frank is debating whether or not he should continue, just based on this kind of bad vibe he was getting, he looks down and notices there's actually running water now. Before at the entrance, it was stagnant, but now he can see the water inside of this mine. It's not stagnant, it's running, and so the risk of breathing in any bad air is pretty much gone, meaning this mine is relatively safe. But despite this supposedly positive development for someone who wanted to explore a mine, Frank is still not sure if he should continue.
This is one of the creepiest mine tunnels I've ever been in, just because of how dilapidated it is and all these chains hanging down from the overhead, and there's a shot looking down the tunnel even further.
But despite his apprehension, Frank ultimately decides, you know what, he'd come this far, I'll just go a little bit.
They say everyone's got that fight or flight instinct, like it's embedded into our genes from way back when. If you get the feeling in the pit of your stomach like something's wrong, you should go with it. Just whatever it is you're doing or about to do, just don't do it, because your body knows. Like, you've got that instinct from back in caveman times kind of stuff. I'm thinking he should have went with his gut feeling and left. I know we all don't go with our gut feeling. Like, we'd be like, I don't think I should. Yeah, I'm going to. But in dangerous situations, go with your gut. Just future reference, go with your gut.
Farther. And so Frank makes it to about 100 feet into this mine when he turns around and he films the opening, the entrance to the mine, which is all lit up with sunlight. And he films it kind of to give the audience a sense of just how far he had come into the mine. And so then, after filming the entrance, he turns the camera and he films back down towards the back of the mine, towards the actual end of the mine. Now, at first, you don't see anything unusual. You just see the chains, and it looks kind of like it had for the first couple of minutes of this video. But then Frank pulls his flashlight out and he shines it down the hall.
Looking down the tunnel here.
I don't like that. Nope. Why are they moving?
One chain is swinging back there.
Dude, there's more. They're all... No.
As we saw, Frank's initial reaction to this swinging chain is speechlessness.
Hold up.
And then just sort of this weird statement. As we saw, Frank's...
That one chain is swinging.
Okay, this one starts to swing, the one behind it's swinging. This one, more than just one are swinging. I mean, that could just be airflow, because there is that big hole up in the top, and, it could be creating a suction. But this one is swinging like Tarzan on a freaking vine. That ain't wind, bruh. Hell no. Stagnated water, running water, I don't give a shit. I would be gone. No. I've seen My Bloody Valentine, and no. No.
Back there.
As we saw, Frank's initial reaction to this swinging chain is speechlessness. And then just sort of this weird statement of fact.
Nope.
He's like, I don't know how that chain is swinging. And then after staring at this chain and even zooming in on it, trying to kind of figure out what he's looking at, Frank eventually would just turn off his camera, turn around, and leave very quickly. And when he got back to his house, he uploaded this video to his channel with virtually no context. He just said, this is what I saw inside of the Horton mine, and nothing happened. It didn't go viral. It isn't like everybody went crazy when they saw this footage. Instead, I think his audience, they saw this video and didn't really know what to make of it. And then very quickly, his audience and Frank just kind of forgot about it. And Frank got back into making his kind of traditional videos. Then, about a year later, the YouTube algorithm kind of noticed this Horton mine footage that he had uploaded back in 2013, and it went crazy viral. And immediately, this video was put under the microscope by YouTube personalities, by TV personalities. I mean, everybody was just kind of taken aback by this footage. And what was determined fairly early on was the actual video itself was authentic. Frank really did film a swinging chain in the Horton mine in Nevada. The question became, who swung the chain? There are many people that believe Frank swung the chain, and this is all just one big hoax, and they point to some of his newer videos after this video went viral, where it appears that Frank is kind of actively going out to find paranormal activity versus just going out and exploring mines. And so they point to that and say, look, he's looking for this stuff. This can't be authentic. This video has to be fake. But others say, look, Frank is just a guy who likes going into mines, and he films the inside of these mines. He's been doing it for years and years, and he just happened to be in one when something unexplainable happened, and he happened to catch it on film. And the only reason he began kind of actively looking for paranormal activity after it went viral is because kind of overnight, his channel exploded, and he suddenly had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of subscribers that all came from that swinging chain video, and they all wanted the same thing: more swinging chain videos, more paranormal content. And so, seeing a great opportunity, Frank went out and began looking for paranormal content. That's why most of his videos, after that video where the swinging chain happened, are kind of geared towards fishing for that kind of stuff. But that first video, that swinging chain video, there wasn't really a good incentive for Frank to fake it at the time he uploaded it. Obviously, now you can say, oh, well, he staged it because he wanted it to go viral and he wanted to become famous and then have this great YouTube career. Look, it's all in front of us. It's so obvious. But how could Frank have possibly predicted that that video would go viral? Going viral is so hard, and it happens so rarely, and it's nearly impossible to predict. And so how could Frank, who had uploaded hundreds and hundreds of videos before, and none of them had come anywhere near virality, how could he have said, this is going to go viral? It's just such a long shot. It also seems very uncharacteristic for Frank to have been diligently uploading on this YouTube channel, which was basically a passion project, for 5 years. He's uploaded 302 videos, and all of them are the same. He's posting the same type of content very consistently for the same small, loyal following. And then out of left field, he uploads his ghost video with no context. Even if he was trying to go viral with this video, he would have known that the most likely outcome would be that the video did not go viral, and instead his small, loyal following that was used to a particular type of content would see this video and be like, why did he upload that? Or worse, they would think, is he faking this? Is this a hoax? And if so, that would totally tarnish his reputation, and he'd lose probably some of his precious few subscribers. I mean, it just didn't feel like the juice was worth the squeeze. But regardless, even though lots of people have said you're lying,
the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. I like that. I've never heard that ever in my life. I'm going to use that sometime eventually. The juice just wasn't worth the squeeze. Everyone, just start using that. Let's make that go viral. Yep, let's do it. From here on out, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Everybody.
Lying, Frank, you're lying, Frank, you're lying, Frank. He said, I'm not lying. I was in the Horton mine. I filmed what I filmed. It's up to you what you believe. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's...
I like that. Not really scary, but I like that. We learned something. And now we have a new catchphrase. The juice just wasn't worth the squeeze. It's been a good day. Been a good day. All right. We're moving on. This one is... This man is the reason the death penalty exists. Mature audiences only. What's wrong with me today? All right. Let's do it to it.
Today's story involves one of the most graphic and upsetting...
Remember, though, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. All of us.
sequences I've ever covered on any story. It also involves harm to minors, so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house in the middle of the night and unplug their iPhone in the middle of a software update. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In the 1960s and 1970s, hitchhiking became very popular amongst young people in America.
This one is so bad. He put a warning at the beginning of it, y'all. He didn't just say it. He also put a warning. Oh,
Hitchhiking is a form of transportation where you basically get rides from strangers. And so the way it works is a hitchhiker will stand on the side of a busy road and they'll extend their arm out and they'll kind of hold their thumb up, which signals to passing motorists that they want to hitchhike. That's the kind of universal sign for hitchhiking. And then a willing motorist, when they see a hitchhiker, they'll pull up alongside and offer a ride. Now, today...
Unless you're a very, very attractive woman, then you hike the skirt and you show the leg. I watched movies. I've seen it. It's true.
It seems unfathomably dangerous to just hop into a stranger's car, or conversely, for a motorist to pick up a random stranger on the side of the road. But back...
I've seen The Hitcher. It's bad.
Then this was considered totally normal and socially acceptable. And so with that in mind, on September 29th, 1978, a 15-year-old girl named Mary Vincent was standing on the side of a highway just outside of Modesto, California, which is not far from San Francisco, California. Mary was a rebellious teenager who had recently run away from her home in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her parents were going through a very nasty divorce, and she just couldn't stand to be in the house anymore, and so that's why she had run away. And so she had hitchhiked all the way up to Los Angeles, California, where her grandfather lived. But after only being there for a couple of days, she became unbelievably homesick and wanted to go back and be around her parents and her family. And so one day when her grandfather was out, she slipped out of his house and she began hitchhiking back to Las Vegas, Nevada. And so she had hitchhiked from Los Angeles to Modesto, California. That's where the first person was willing to drive her to. And so she was on that strip of highway in Modesto looking for another ride that could take her farther south. She was on this highway with 2 other young hitchhikers. They all had these signs that said going south, so they weren't just holding their thumbs out, they were holding these signs. And so the 3 of them are huddled in a group, they're holding their signs up, and at some point, mid-afternoon, this light blue passenger van that only had 1 passenger, it was the driver, he was a 50-something-year-old man, he looked pretty harmless. He pulled over when he saw their sign.
White van. Red flag.
And he parked on the side of the road maybe 15 feet ahead of where they were. And so Mary's companions stayed where they were, and Mary ran up to this light blue van, and she looked through the passenger...
Light blue? That was a picture of a white van. Mrballen, your profile. We all seen that, right? Hold on. Was that light blue?
The old man, he looked pretty harmless. He pulled over when he saw their signs.
That's white. That's not light blue. Come on, mister.
And he parked on the side of the road, maybe 15 feet ahead of where they were. And so Mary's companions stayed where they were, and Mary ran up to this light blue van, and she looked through the passenger side window, which had been rolled down, and she asked this guy, hey, can you give all three of us a ride? We're going south. And this man, he would look at her and say, I can only give you a ride. I can't give the other two a ride. I can only give you a ride. And so Mary is confused because she's looking at this guy and she's seeing all this space in his van, and she's thinking to herself, why am I only allowed to go when they're going the same place I'm going and there's plenty of room in this van? But when she kind of gently prodded this man and said, well, are you sure you don't mind taking them too? He just said, look, I will take you. I will not take them. And so Mary said, okay, well, hold on. Let me go back and get my bag. And so he stays parked. She leaves the van and she runs back to the other two people she was with. And, she explains the situation, and they tell her, Mary, this is not good. There's clearly something off with this guy. But Mary, even though she too shared this kind of reservation about this guy, she was so desperate to get home. She was so homesick that she couldn't face the idea of having to wait around for another ride, which might not come until the next day or the day after, because not every motorist is willing to pick up hitchhikers. And she just did not want to wait any longer. And so she told her companions that, guys, I'm going to take the ride. And so she says goodbye to her two friends, she grabs her bag, and she runs back up to the van, and she hops in the passenger seat. As soon as she sat down and closed the door, this man pulled back out onto the road and started driving, and then he turned and looked at Mary and introduced himself. His name was Lawrence Singleton, and he was 50 years old. And then Mary, she introduced herself, and then they had some small talk, and very quickly, Mary feels at ease around Lawrence. He kind of reminded her of her grandfather. He was very nice, very polite. And so when she started to feel tired, pretty early on in their trip, she said, hey, Lawrence, do you mind if I doze off while you drive? And Lawrence would say, no problem. Go ahead, go to sleep. And so Mary turned away from Lawrence and kind of curled up on the seat, and pretty quickly she was asleep. A little while later, when she woke up, she looked out the window and immediately could tell they were going the wrong way. So she turns to Lawrence and says, we're going the wrong way. And Lawrence would say, oh, you know what? I made a mistake. I'll get us turned around. Sorry about that. I had no idea. But Mary's thinking to herself, we're really far in the wrong direction. And there's no way he accidentally did this. But she kind of bit her tongue because Lawrence would actually turn around and start going in the right direction. And so they're traveling in the proper direction for a little while, and Mary's totally on edge, but she's careful not to give that off to Lawrence because she doesn't really know this guy. And even though he did make her feel comfortable, she just doesn't really know what his intentions are. And so she's just kind of looking around pretty apprehensively.
I'm very sure we can guess what his intentions are.
And then they pull into this stretch of highway that kind of ran through this fairly forested area where very few cars were on this stretch of road. And Lawrence suddenly tells Mary that he wants to pull over because he has to go to the bathroom. He wants to relieve himself. And so Mary kind of apprehensively says, yeah, okay, that's fine. And so as Lawrence is beginning to pull off of the highway, Mary happens to look down at her feet, and she notices one of her shoes is untied. And instinctually, Mary just thought to herself, I better make sure that shoe gets tied because I might need to run away from this guy. But she didn't want to reach down and start tying her shoe. It was kind of awkward because the space was small, and she was worried it would be kind of suspicious if she did it. And so she thought, okay, as soon as we pull off, I'll get out of the car and I'll tie my shoe. And so Lawrence, he pulls over, but he doesn't just pull over onto the shoulder of this road. Instead, he pulls into this access road that kind of trails into the forest. And so as soon as he turned onto this road, the alarm bells are going off in Mary's head. She knows something is wrong, but she doesn't really know what to say to Lawrence because he's not talking to her, and she doesn't really want to look at him. And so she's just kind of going over in her head what she's going to do. Is she going to run? Is she going to confront him? She doesn't know. And then eventually, after about a minute or so, when they are far enough away from the main road that no one on that road could see them, they're pretty far into this forest, Lawrence stops the car and he hops out to go relieve himself. And immediately Mary, she hops out of the car too, and she bends down to tie her shoe. Before she could finish tying her shoe, suddenly something smacked her hard in the back of the head and it knocked her unconscious. It was Lawrence. He had hid a hammer next to his seat, and when he had gotten out, he did not go relieve himself. Instead, he walked around the vehicle and smashed her in the head. When Mary came to, she realized she was laying down in the back of the van, and as she was looking out the windows, she could see that they were still parked out in the middle of the forest. And then when she tried to move, she realized her hands, her feet, everything had been tied down to the van. She couldn't move. And so as she's wondering what's going on, Lawrence comes around, he opens the back doors to this van, he hops inside, and he begins assaulting her. Mary has no idea what to do. She's a 15-year-old kid, and this guy is on top of her. He's not stopping. And so she just began quietly begging him to please stop, set me free. I won't tell anyone. She just kept repeating that over and over and over again, and Lawrence never spoke back. He just continued the assault for hours and hours. Finally, when Lawrence got tired, he got off of Mary and he climbed out of the back of the truck and he went around and he climbed into one of the front seats and he fell asleep. And so Mary probably tried to free herself from her restraints, but there was nothing she could do. The restraints were tied too tightly. And so for hours, she must have just laid there wondering what was going to happen to her. And then at some point in the middle of the night, Lawrence wakes up again, and without saying a word to Mary, he just climbs out of the van and gets into the driver's seat and then drives the van out of the forest. He drives on the main road for a little while until he turns down another access road that takes them away from the main road, so away from any prying eyes, and he comes to a stop somewhere out in this forest in the middle of this big canyon. Lawrence parks the van, he climbs out, walks around to the back, he opens up the back doors where Mary is laying there whimpering and crying and begging to be set free. He climbs inside and her torture continues for hours and hours until the sun finally came up. At which point Lawrence stopped. He climbed out of the back of the van and he's standing out there and he turns around so he's facing Mary and he reaches in and he undoes her restraints. So he frees her, he pulls her out of the van and stands her up on the ground. And so she's crying, she's beaten, she's bloodied, she doesn't know what's going on. And she just gently says to him, "Please set me free." And he says, "Oh, you want to be set free? I'll set you free." And so he walks around this totally destroyed 15-year-old girl and he reaches into the back of his van where there's this toolbox and he pulls out a hatchet. And so he walks back and he's standing in front of Mary, and Mary would have had a fraction of a second to see what was in his hand before, in one fluid motion, he reaches and grabs her left arm with his left hand. He grabs her on the wrist, then he raises his hatchet up and he brings it down on her left forearm, severing her arm off right below the elbow. And so Mary falls backwards to the ground and she looks down at where her left arm just was. She's in shock. And before she can do anything, Lawrence just walks over and with his left hand again, he reaches over and grabs her right wrist. And now Mary knows what he's about to do. He's still holding this hatchet. And so she's screaming and she's kicking him as hard as she can to try to get him off of her, but his grip is too strong. And then he begins to chop at her right forearm over and over again. It would take 4 hard blows to finally sever her right arm off of her body. And so Mary falls to the ground in a heap. She's bleeding profusely. She's screaming in agonizing pain. And all Lawrence can focus on is that one of Mary's amputated hands was clutched on to his left arm. When he cut off her left hand, it had gripped onto his arm and now it was stuck to him. And so very nonchalantly, he began trying to flick this hand off of his arm. And then finally, when it did come off, he turned and looked at Mary and realized she had gone silent and she was limp and she was laying in a huge pool of blood. And so Lawrence put the bloody hatchet back inside of his van, and then he just walked over to Mary and grabbed her and began dragging her. About 100 feet down the road from the van was a culvert. A culvert is a big tunnel that goes underneath roads. It allows water and runoff to pass by the road without damaging it. And so this particular culvert underneath this access road was built about 30 feet below the surface of the road. And so if you were standing on the road over the area where this culvert was, if you walked to the edge of the road on either side, there would be a 30-foot drop-off down to the opening of this culvert on either side. And so Lawrence dragged Mary all the way over to this section of the road over the culvert and then chucked her lifeless body off the side, smashing it down onto the rocks below. And then Lawrence walked around very carefully all the way down to her body and stuffed her inside of the actual culvert. And then as he was walking away, he said to her, "Now you're free." After Lawrence left, Mary should have been dead. Really, she should have died at several points along this attack. But miraculously, Mary did not die. And in fact, she would later say she vividly remembered the entire attack. She was fully lucid, fully conscious, fully aware for the entire thing, save for the moment when she was knocked unconscious by the hammer. And so she vividly remembered having her arms amputated, and she specifically remembered one particular point in the beginning, before her left arm, the first arm, had been amputated. He grabbed her left wrist, and she in turn instinctively grabbed with her left hand onto his left arm. So she's clutching onto him. And so when he came down and cut her arm off, she began falling backwards. But she remembered thinking to herself, why am I falling backwards? I just grabbed onto his arm. I had a firm grip. And then as she's falling, it's like time is standing still. She literally saw her hand still clutching his arm and saw it had been cut off of her body. And then when Lawrence cut off her right arm, despite being in agonizing pain, it's like she instinctively understood that she has to pretend to be dead. Otherwise, she will die. And so she went totally limp. Her eyes were half open, and she watched as Lawrence is flicking her left hand, the one that she thought she had gripped onto when she was falling back. She watched as he shook that hand off of his arm. And then she was limp as he grabbed her and dragged her the 100 feet to the culvert. And she was limp and still and didn't make a sound when he threw her 30 feet down onto jagged rocks, and she broke 4 of her ribs. She was in excruciating pain, but her will to survive was telling her, make no sound, take this punishment, and you will survive. And then after he left, she remembers thinking, I don't know where he is. He could be waiting up on the road for me. I can't just crawl out and try to save myself, because then he might actually finish me off. And so she laid in this culvert in this horrible position, totally contorted, with her arms gone and broken ribs. And then finally, after a while, she started to feel exceptionally tired, and that was from blood loss. And she said there was a voice in her head telling her, you can't go to sleep. If you go to sleep, you're going to die. And if you die, we can't catch this monster, and he's going to do this to someone else. And so she had this surge of adrenaline where she decided, I'm going to live. I'm going to get out of here. I don't know if he's still up there, but I have to get out and I have to try to save myself. And so somehow she got out of the...
Oh my God. What kind of fucked up person is he? Sweet baby Jesus. That is a lot to take in at one time, Mr. Bell. I now understand the warning. This poor young girl. Oh my God, I don't know. I don't understand how people can hurt other people like that. Like, I know the premise of it. I'm not stupid. I just don't understand the want to. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I want to hurt this dude that did this. Like, but I mean, if he's the reason why they invented the death penalty, I really highly doubt that there's any way to hurt him. He's dead. So, but honestly, death was way too good for him. They should have just left him in prison so he could be assaulted. Like, his farts smell like Vaseline. Tumbleweeds fall out, kind of assaulted. Just saying.
The culvert, and then once she was on the ground, she dug the nubs of her arms into the dirt and attempted to pack the wound with dirt and mud. And then afterwards, she raised her arms up over her head because she didn't want the blood and muscles to fall out. And so with her mutilated arms up over her head, she managed to crawl up this embankment up onto the road. She's got no clothes on. She's covered head to toe in blood. She's in shock, and she starts running down the highway. highway, and a car would actually come by fairly quickly, but they were so startled at what they were seeing, they didn't stop and they drove on. And so Mary would ultimately run 3 miles on this highway before finally flagging down a passing motorist. It happened to be a young couple. And after they got over the initial shock of what Mary actually looked like, they put her inside of their car and they sped to the hospital. Mary would stay in the hospital for a month. And during that time, she would give police all this information about her attacker, about Lawrence Singleton. And using her very detailed description of him, the police were able to come up with a very good composite sketch. And Lawrence Singleton's neighbor happened to see that sketch, and they turned him in. Lawrence was ultimately sentenced to 14 years in prison for what he did to Mary. It was the maximum sentence that the judge could give. The judge wanted to do more, but legally they couldn't. And so Mary, she testified at court. And so after it all ended and he was sentenced, Mary was leaving the courthouse. And as she passed by Lawrence, it was the one time she had to be physically close to him, he turned and kind of leaned into her and said, "I will finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life." 8 years later, Lawrence was paroled for good behavior. And so, of course, this terrified Mary, who by now had become a wife and she had 2 sons. And so she's worried that now that this guy is free, he's going to come and finish the job. But Lawrence would not go after Mary. Instead, 10 years after he got out on parole, he would attack another woman, a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes. And unfortunately, he would kill her. At Roxanne's murder trial, Mary would actually testify against Lawrence, and her testimony is what they used to secure a death sentence for Lawrence. But before he could be executed, Lawrence died of cancer in jail in 2001. When Mary heard that Lawrence had died,
we didn't even get the benefit of killing him ourselves. That makes me even more angry. Piece of shit.
She felt very cheated. However, her sons were very relieved to find out that her attacker had died, and so she took some solace in that. Outrage over Lawrence's early release, considering what he did to Mary, and the fact that that early release led to another person being killed, led to the creation of the Lawrence Singleton Bill, which gives judges the ability to give 25-year to life sentences in cases that involve torture. Meaning, under this bill, Lawrence would never have gotten out of prison after what he did to Mary. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you have not done this already, please sneak into...
Oh, I got something on today's episode. People are shit. Not all people. Not all people. I cannot physically wrap my mind around why somebody would want to do that. I believe they said she was, what, 15? 15? 15? I believe. That's a child, bro. Then he gets a death penalty after getting released and actually killing another person. And we don't even get the benefit of killing that son of a bitch. Motherfucker. Alright. Yeah. I'm glad that's the last one because I couldn't know. Damn. Alright, y'all. So if you're a fan of the spooky, creepy, strange, deranged, think about subscribing. If you're a fan of today's video, think about leaving a thumbs up. You know, the thumbs up really does help my collection of thumbs. As always, be good to one another. I'll see you in the next one. Stay spooky.